The myth of the clean Wehrmacht is an idea that emerged out of the post-World War II world that the soldiers of the German armed forces during World War II, including the Wehrmacht, Kriegsmarine, and Luftwaffe, were not complicit in nor carried out any war crimes on behalf of Nazi Germany. It asserts that only the SS and Nazi Party were responsible for the horrific atrocities carried out during the war, including the Holocaust, and that the Wehrmacht and its soldiers were simply noble, apolitical men fighting for their country, and were not fundamentally different to the average American, British, or Soviet soldier. This was not the case, of course. Although much has been done to debunk the myth in the public conscious of the Western world, if you go to the YouTube comments of any video concerning Germany in World War II, or Reddit posts or Facebook, you will see these tropes constantly reiterated, whether it be about German soldiers collectively or about individuals such as Erwin Rommel. Firstly, I will discuss the origin of the myth historically and both how and why it developed, analyze the key pillars of the myth, and finally I will debunk the myth, documenting the crimes of the Wehrmacht individually and their broader complicity in the actualization of genocidal Nazi ideology. The origins of the clean Wehrmacht myth can be traced back to as early as the Nuremberg trials, when the International Military Tribunal convened on November 20th, 1945, chronicle and publicized the crimes of Nazi Germany. Many of the Nazi officers and party officials on trial refused to acknowledge their role or complicity in Nazi atrocities, fearing that they would be killed if they admitted guilt. Generals such as Heinz Guderian, who were presented with evidence of orders to execute prisoners and resistance members, simply denied ever receiving the orders. Even Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany both before and during the war, denied not only participating in the Holocaust, but denied ever knowing it was taking place. Although many Nazi war criminals were executed during the trial, these acts of defiance by the guilty would help lay the foundation for the myth. The world changed dramatically following the end of World War II, and the New World Order was established, with the West on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. Many in the West were terrified of a communist presence on their doorstep in Europe and a potential Soviet invasion into Western Europe. Politicians such as Joseph McCarthy and Basil Liddell Hart, in preparation for conflict against a new enemy, even campaigned for and helped acquit many Nazi war criminals, so they could utilize their knowledge and services to better prepare for war with the Soviet Union. Other prominent individuals such as the British Maurice Hankey went so far as to say the war crime trials were wrong, even those against the Japanese, and lobbied for convicted war criminals to be released and for the ongoing trials to be stopped. Furthermore, and very crucially during the Nuremberg trials, the Wehrmacht were not classified as a criminal organization unlike the SS. When prosecuted, this meant that Wehrmacht war criminals were not labeled as criminals, and thus a distinction was drawn between them, their SS counterparts, and members of the Wehrmacht High Command. When the Communist-led and Soviet-backed North Korean army crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea on June 25, 1950, beginning the Korean War, this renewed fears of an imminent conflict with the Soviet Union. The Americans realized the urgent need for a rearmed West Germany to act as a bulwark against Soviet invasion, and that the German army would need to be revived. Konrad Adenauer, the West German Chancellor, arranged meetings with former Wehrmacht generals in October, where they drafted the Himmerod Memorandum in Himmerod Abbey, calling for the release of German prisoners and for a reformed image of the German soldier. The Western Allies honored the memorandum, and thus the clean Wehrmacht myth was codified. Adenauer would help further victimize the Wehrmacht and its soldiers by stating in fall that same year that the treatment of Wehrmacht veterans was, quote, completely unjust, and that, quote, the time for collective guilt of the militarists must be ended once and for all. Adenauer also ended the policies of denazification and even went as far as appointing Hermann Furch, an ardent Nazi, as one of his defense advisors. The denazification policy had been further complicated by the liberal issuing of party membership by the Nazi Party during and before the war, making it difficult for the occupying powers to identify who was an adherent of the ideology and who was not, which meant many true Nazis slipping through the cracks. Prior to the formation of the Bundeswehr in 1955, the official army of West Germany, the Western Allies created the Schnellstruppe in 1949, a paramilitary force made up of former Wehrmacht and SS soldiers who would conduct guerrilla war in the event of a Soviet invasion, delaying them until NATO could marshal troops for a comprehensive defense. Within West Germany itself, public opinion was broadly supportive of the Wehrmacht and war criminals in general. As Potential History points out in his video titled Germany, the Cold War and a Pervasive Narrative, many German families had sons, fathers, and brothers drafted into the Wehrmacht owing to the nature of total war, and this made it difficult for many German civilians to confront the harsh reality that their loved ones may have committed horrific atrocities, or at the very least been complicit in them. West German media portrayed Wehrmacht veterans as victims of Nazi ideology rather than perpetrators, pushing the idea that Hitler basically dragged them kicking and screaming into World War II. In 1955, the last German prisoners released from Soviet captivity swore an oath on the 7th of October, stating that, quote, "We swear that we have neither committed murder, nor defiled, nor plundered. If we have brought suffering and misery on other people, it was done according to the laws of war." West German novels and films such as Edgar Wright's Heimat or Helmer Sanders Brahms' Germany Pale Mother portray German soldiers as victims having gone off to war to return back to destroyed homes, or portray them as soldiers with no moral agency or autonomy, simply forced to commit heinous acts. In the 50s and 60s, several important events occurred that further helped develop this myth. In 1950 and 1955, Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein released their war memoirs titled Panzerleader and Lost Victories, respectively. While both these generals wrote falsehoods about the war and their failures in it, what was more sinister was their active attempt to downplay or outright lie about their complicity in Nazi war crimes. Most significantly, Guderian denied that his troops carried out the Commissar Order, which called for the immediate execution of Soviet political commissars after being captured. Guderian also downplays his close relationship with the Nazi Party elite, and the fact that he was given bribes, including estates and payments of 2,000 marks a month. Guderian continues to play into other common tropes, such as claiming the Nazi civilian administration as responsible for ordering and carrying out atrocities, as well as blaming Germany's crippling defeat in the East on the winter. Basically, the average r/history user. Manstein's memoirs echoed similar talking points. At Nuremberg, both these generals, among many others, did their best Sergeant Schultz impressions when questioned on their unit's involvement in the Holocaust. Franz Halder is another important figure in this story as well. Halder was the Wehrmacht's chief of staff throughout the war, and following its end, helped draft a general's memorandum in November 1945, along with Manstein and General Walter von Brauchitsch, claiming the Wehrmacht to be a solely apolitical force wholly separate from National Socialist ideology or its crimes. Following the war, he was hired by the US government to work in the US Army's Historical Division, where he was responsible for writing a semi-official history of World War II from the German perspective. Halder, along with other German officers he was working with in the department, coordinated with one another to portray a consistent narrative of the war. Halder would claim he was against the war in the East and Nazism more broadly, coaching other Nazi officers on how to disappear incriminating evidence. While the Americans were largely aware not only of Nazi atrocities, as well as attempts by former Wehrmacht soldiers like Halder to cover them up, the geopolitical situation at the time, especially concerning the Soviet Union, motivated them to turn a blind eye at these revisionist efforts. The Americans took the Nazis at their word. Halder would oversee the writing of 2,500 documents by 700 officers. Furthermore, there needed to be a revival of the German army, as previously stated, to act as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, and the public conscience needed to believe that the Wehrmacht was clean in order to then believe that the new German army was also clean, as many Wehrmacht officers would occupy high-ranking positions in the new Bundeswehr. This became embedded in West Germany's cultural memory and was reinforced by Western historians who used German officer testimonies after the war to help write the bulk of their work, along with Western media which pushed the idea. German historians at the time were also susceptible to overlooking certain things, partly due to the influence of national pride, but another factor contributing to their lack of coverage was that the Western Allies had seized all of the Wehrmacht and SS's records and documents, denying German historians access until much later on. Another important event in the development of the myth occurred in 1966. That year, several high-profile Nazis who had escaped the noose at Nuremberg were released from Spandau prison, namely Albert Speer. Speer's memoirs, known as the Spandau Diaries, were published to great critical acclaim and financial success. He became somewhat of a celebrity, receiving book deals and interviews, and the media broadly failed to question his narrative that he had nothing to do with the Holocaust. At the same time, however, a turning point was beginning to develop in historians' attitudes to the Wehrmacht. After Speer was released, he donated his diary called the Chronicle to the German Federal Archives, but the version he donated had been deceptively edited by his friend Rudolf Wolters, removing any mention of Jews or the Holocaust. It was David Irving, of all people, before he became a psychotic Holocaust denier, who noticed discrepancies between Speer's account of his actions and primary documents from the war. West German historical discourse also gravitated towards taking a more critical eye on the Wehrmacht's role during the war. The 1960s saw military historians begin to challenge the image of the Wehrmacht presented during the 40s and 50s. Documents that the Allies seized post-war were now returned to West Germany and became open to investigation by German scholars. There are several key pillars of the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. Firstly, that the Wehrmacht were apolitical. Secondly, the Rommel myth. And thirdly, that the Wehrmacht were not complicit in, nor had perpetuated themselves, any war crimes. One of the most common talking points used to support the idea of the clean Wehrmacht was that they were an apolitical fighting force, while the SS were ideologically motivated. This pillar of the myth states that the Wehrmacht had no ideological ties to the Nazi Party, was fighting for its country, and was no different to any modern military. This is simply not true, and there are various events and things we can look at to prove this. As early as 1934, Wehrmacht soldiers were forced to swear an oath, known as the Führer Oath, to Adolf Hitler. Most militaries nowadays require soldiers to swear an oath to the Constitution, but for the Wehrmacht, their oath of allegiance was to Hitler. From 1919 to 1933, German soldiers of the Reichswehr were to swear an oath to the Constitution, the office of the presidency, and the legal institutions of the Reich. The oath the Wehrmacht soldiers had to swear on the other hand was as follows. I swear to God this holy oath that I shall render unconditional obedience to the leader of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, and that as a brave soldier I shall at times be prepared to give my life for this oath. This oath was not imposed by Hitler onto the German soldiery, but rather Wehrmacht commanders requiring soldiers to take the oath and adopt Nazi symbols on their uniforms to surprise Hitler and demonstrate their loyalty. From 1938 onwards, following the Blomberg-Frisch affair, the military ceased to exist as a state within a state like it did under the Weimar Republic, but was now a technocratic organization that existed to execute Hitler's war plans. On December 8, 1938, the OKW instructed that all officers in the Navy, Army, and Air Force be well versed in Nazi ideology, and ideological pamphlets were issued as required reading from February 1939. Furthermore, by 1941, roughly one-third of the Wehrmacht's junior officers were ardent Nazi Party members. After Germany's remarkable success in invading and conquering Poland and Western Europe, Hitler turned his sights to the enemy in the East. In spite of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Hitler had always viewed the Soviet Union as Germany's ultimate enemy. According to him, the quote, blood Jew in the USSR had killed or starved about 30 million people with positively fanatical savagery, and that Judeo-Bolshevism, which had manifested itself in the Soviet state, needed to be eradicated in its entirety. This core tenet of Nazi ideology went hand in hand with Lebensraum, a desire to conquer and settle the territory east of Germany to create a 1,000-year Aryan empire. After the Soviet Union was defeated, the Jews were to be eliminated and Slavs were to be enslaved to labor in the creation of the Nazi Empire. In the eyes of British historian Richard Evans, Operation Barbarossa and the invasion of the Soviet Union was a genocidal war of extermination right from the beginning. There is nothing that debunks the clean Wehrmacht myth more clearly than this for me. Since the entire point of the invasion of the USSR was to exterminate the local population in pursuit of Nazi territorial ambitions and racial ideology, and since the Wehrmacht was a military force chiefly responsible for the invasion, it had become responsible for enacting Nazi ideology. As Omer Bartov points out, quote, the Wehrmacht marched into the Soviet Union equipped with a set of orders that translated Hitler's notion of a war of extermination and subjugation into the practical terminology of the military. It doesn't matter if the individual soldier believed in Nazi ideology or not, when the broader goals of their individual actions are in pursuit of genocide. It cannot be emphasized enough that the entire purpose of the war on the Eastern Front was one of complete and total annihilation of the Soviet people. As Felix Rearm, a German historian, states, quote, in the form of such ideologized troop leaders, the German warfare received a National Socialist influence. Not all of them needed to be National Socialists in order to view the fight as a war of worldviews. The existence and implementation of the criminal orders by the Wehrmacht, chiefly the Commissar Order and the Barbarossa Decree, highlight the extent to which Nazi ideology permeated the organization. The Commissar Order, which called for the immediate execution of all Soviet political commissars when captured, was issued officially to German troops on the 6th of June 1941, right before Operation Barbarossa. Manstein, who denied ever passing the order down to his subordinates both when standing trial at Nuremberg and in his memoirs, did in fact carry out the orders, as did most German units involved, including Guderians. The order clearly violated international law and any wartime conventions that Germany had agreed to, but since the war had been reduced to primitive racial terms, with the Soviets being viewed as subhuman, most German soldiers and officers saw no problem in carrying it out. It called for the immediate segregation of political commissars from the rest of the troops once captured, denied them their rights under international law, and ordered their execution, leading to the deaths of thousands of Soviet political commissars, carried out by Wehrmacht troops and the SS. Furthermore, German OKW chief Wilhelm Keitel signed the Barbarossa Decree on May 13, 1941, which allowed German officers and soldiers to commit crimes against humanity in the East without facing any future prosecution by German authorities. Influenced by the decree, General Erich Höppner of the 4th Panzer Group stated, quote, "The war against Russia is an important chapter in the German nation's struggle for existence. It is the old battle of the Germanic against the Slavic people, of the defense of European culture against Muscovite Asian inundation, and of the repulse of Jewish Bolshevism. The objective of this battle must be the demolition of present-day Russia and must therefore be conducted with unprecedented severity. Every military action must be guided in planning and execution by an iron resolution to exterminate the enemy remorselessly and totally. In particular, no adherents of the contemporary Russian Bolshevik system are to be spared." Another pillar of the clean Wehrmacht myth is the Rommel myth. The phrase Rommel myth is used to describe the various legends and depictions of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel as an apolitical and brilliant commander who firmly rejected Nazi ideology and conducted his wars with honor. This myth started during the war amongst the Allied press to explain away their constant failures against Rommel in the North African campaign. It is said that Rommel's Afrika Korps conducted the war cleanly, refusing Hitler's orders to exterminate Jews, treated Allied POWs humanely, and fought a war without hate. Although a separate myth on its own, the Rommel myth feeds into the broader clean Wehrmacht idea, and Rommel himself is often cited as one of the honorable soldiers in the German army to dispel the idea that the Wehrmacht were wholly complicit in fascist atrocities. Firstly, Rommel was not apolitical and welcomed Hitler's rise to power like much of the German officer corps. He also cultivated a close relationship with Hitler, receiving promotions from him and personal command of a panzer division, despite the army refusing his request. In 1942 in Libya, the Afrika Korps participated in a pogrom of Jews in the city of Benghazi and helped the Italians set up a concentration camp which interred 3,500 Jews, of which 600 died due to the poor conditions. He built a close working relationship with Walter Rauff, instrumental in the creation and implementation of the gas vans used to exterminate Jews and other undesirables. Some cite Rommel's apparent role in the 20th of July plot to kill Hitler as evidence of his honor, but there is no evidence to suggest that he had any major involvement and only had superficial knowledge of the plot according to historian Ian Beckett. Rommel was held up on a pedestal as an honorable warrior and brilliant commander, the poster boy of the clean Wehrmacht, but all available evidence points to the contrary and dispels not just the Rommel myth, but an essential pillar of the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. The third and final pillar of the clean Wehrmacht myth is obviously that they were clean. This tenet of the myth states that the Wehrmacht had no knowledge of Nazi war crimes, did not participate nor were complicit in any atrocities, and that any crimes committed were done by the SS. Unsurprisingly, this is not true, and I will examine some of the most egregious examples of Wehrmacht atrocities committed during the war, both on the Eastern Front and elsewhere. One example of Wehrmacht atrocities was the systematic starvation, negligence, and inhumane treatment towards Soviet POWs during the war. The beginning of Barbarossa was a disaster for the Red Army, who suffered millions of casualties, many of whom were captured. Throughout the war, roughly 5.7 million Red Army soldiers were captured as prisoners by the Germans, and roughly 3.3 million died in captivity, with most dying of starvation. In the first 8 months of Barbarossa alone, 2.5 million of the 3.3 million died. Their deaths were a direct result of Nazi policy and ideology, and the Wehrmacht were complicit in this. 60% of Soviet POWs died during the war, compared to only 4% of non-Soviet Allied POWs dying in German captivity. A Wehrmacht 4th Army Corps report on June 8, 1941 stated that, quote, "Prisoners of war are to be fed with the most primitive rations, for example horseflesh. High quality and scarce food and luxury goods may not be given out to them. The camps where soldiers were held were severely overcrowded, which led to diseases spreading quickly, and when transported by rail, were packed into open train cars like cattle, and many froze to death in the harsh Russian winters while being transported to concentration camps. For example, in a rear camp near Rzhev that supported the 9th Army, 450 prisoners were packed into a one-story barracks measuring roughly 11 meters by 22 meters. When the pressing needs of labor superseded Nazi ideology, Hitler authorized the use of Russian labor in Germany in October 1941. Of the roughly 3 million captured prisoners, German economic officials noted that only 200,000 was physically able to work, the rest diseased or severely emaciated. Forced marches, disease, and prisoners turning on one another desperate for food were some of the causes of mass death among Soviet POWs. That same month, Wehrmacht Quartermaster General Eduard Wagner ordered that prisoners unable to work would have their rations reduced, which sparked an enormous rise in deaths. As Stephen Fritz states in his book Ostkrieg, quote, "Since these catastrophic conditions also existed in camps in the Reich, the mass deaths of Soviet prisoners of war was not due to ignorance or incompetence. To the Nazi leadership, it was axiomatic that Germans and Russians could not both be fed. The former would, thus, be supplied at the expense of the latter, regardless of the consequences." The systematic starvation and mistreatment of Soviet POWs, a horrific crime against humanity, was authorized and aided by the Wehrmacht, thus proving their participation in Nazi atrocities. The Wehrmacht also collaborated closely with the Einsatzgruppe, or Nazi mobile death squads, responsible for massacring Jews and other Untermensch in Nazi-occupied territories. Throughout the war, and especially in the East, the Wehrmacht provided security, logistical support to the Einsatzgruppe, and Wehrmacht engineers even went as far as to dig the pits that bodies would be dumped into after the massacres. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, prior to Barbarossa, ordered all German army commanders to cooperate in their entirety with Einsatzgruppe units, along with instructing them to identify and register Jews in occupied areas. All of this was done under the guise of anti-partisan or anti-bandit warfare, but in reality was just used as an excuse to kill Jews. Despite Germany's overwhelming success in the opening phases of Barbarossa, many Red Army soldiers who were not captured or killed continued to operate as partisans, causing havoc in the German rear areas. Stalin officially sanctioned partisan warfare on July 3rd, and as partisan activity began to increase, German soldiers felt increasingly vulnerable to attacks from the rear, which motivated them to cooperate closely with the SS, Gestapo, and Einsatzgruppe. Jews and partisans were one and the same, and the Wehrmacht security divisions, in tandem with party organs, went to work. On a more general scale, mass murders of Jews such as that of Babi Yar were only possible due to the Wehrmacht's military success in battle, opening up that territory for Nazis to enact their racial ideology. However, also at Babi Yar, the close relationship between the commander of the 6th Army, Walter von Reichenau, and SS Colonel Paul Blobel, commander of Sonderkommando 4A of Einsatzgruppe C, indicated a more direct complicity of Wehrmacht forces in Nazi crimes. While the Jews of Kiev were marched to Babi Yar, the Wehrmacht troops guarded their route. Not only that, but the 6th Army's political unit produced 2,000 posters directing the Jews to assemble before being marched to their deaths. From the 29th to the 30th of September 1941, 33,771 Jews were killed at Babi Yar. There was, however, a vast discrepancy between the number of so-called partisans killed and the number of German soldiers killed. For example, one unit killed 10,000 people in a month, losing only 2 dead and 5 wounded. As previously mentioned, anti-partisan warfare was simply a euphemism to exterminate the racial enemies of the Third Reich. In the first 6 months of Barbarossa, 500,000 Soviet Jews were slaughtered, with the willing and active cooperation of the Wehrmacht. Outside of the Soviet Union, in Yugoslavia, the Wehrmacht slaughtered roughly 2,800 Serbs in retaliation for a partisan attack in the Gornji Milanovac district that killed 10 German soldiers and wounded 26. On the 21st of October, Serb men and boys were assembled in groups of 50 to 120 and killed by Wehrmacht soldiers manning machine guns. From August 1942, Führer Directive 46 entrusted the Wehrmacht with coordinating anti-bandit operations in its areas of jurisdiction and the SS in areas under civil administration. It is therefore clear that the Wehrmacht was both directly and indirectly responsible for crimes against humanity in the name of anti-partisan warfare, slaughtering innocents for Nazi ideology. The war in the East from the very beginning was one of annihilation, and this is reflected in the adoption of the Hunger Plan. Devised by Nazi Party officials, it entailed food being seized from the Soviet civilian population and distributed to German civilians and soldiers. Hitler had been influenced significantly by the hunger German civilians felt during World War I and was determined that they never face such a situation again. This policy categorically denied food from large segments of the Soviet population, notably Jews and POWs, who were denied access to food markets or to farmers. It must be noted that while Nazi officials and Wehrmacht soldiers were supportive of the policy, many of the lower ranks exhibited some humanity towards starving Soviet civilians. Contrary to regulations, some German field kitchens shared their food with starving civilians, and individual soldiers their rations. However, this does not negate or make up for in any way the Wehrmacht's complicity in the Hunger Plan and the systematic starvation of Soviet civilians. German troops plundered large stocks of livestock, grain, and dairy, and the OKH issued a directive on November 1st ordering soldiers to not share provisions with civilians. Army Group Center adopted a policy of eating the country bare, and seized enough food not only just to satisfy itself, but also feed the Reich. However, transportation difficulties meant this reserve of food destined for Germany never made it, and became spoiled in the winter of 1941 to 1942, leaving almost nothing for the local population. Soviet POWs, as previously mentioned, were the first targets of the implementation of the Hunger Plan. Polish civilians of non-German ethnicity and Polish Jews also suffered from systematic starvation under this policy. Estimates of death tolls due to mass starvation are in the millions, with Timothy Snyder stating that 4.2 million people died as a result. It is clear, though, that although the policy was devised by Nazi bureaucrats, that the Wehrmacht actively participated in the forced requisitioning of foodstuffs in the eastern occupied territories, depriving the local population of food it needed to survive, leading to the death by starvation of millions, thus further stating the idea of the clean Wehrmacht. One of the most egregious and systemic atrocities of the Wehrmacht was their extensive use of sex slavery and the creation of field brothels for its soldiers. These crimes went under the radar for a long period of time after the war due to the fact that sexual assault crimes were never actually tried during the Nuremberg trials. Rape and sexual assault was endemic in the German army during World War II, particularly on the Eastern Front, with soldiers having leave after intense combat on the front lines and troops in general seeking sexual release. The Wehrmacht saw the need to create brothels for soldiers. Women in the occupied territories were often forced at gunpoint into sexual slavery, some as young as 15. In other cases, some women felt forced into it to feed themselves and their families due to the Germans forcibly starving the civilian population as part of the Hunger Plan. Although you may not believe that Jewish and other undesirable women were victims of rape, such as gypsy or black women due to the Nazis' racial beliefs, they too suffered. As Wendy Gertjejanssen points out, it didn't matter if German soldiers had sex with inferior women, as brothel sex did not foster quote-unquote inner bonding. And to the average soldier who partook in the brothels, all that mattered was that she had a vagina. Through both the brothel system and other methods, over 10 million women were raped by German soldiers on the Eastern Front. This was something both sanctioned and approved of by the Wehrmacht High Command and the Nazi leadership. Venereal disease was so rife amongst German troops that Walter von Brauchitsch, the German army commander-in-chief, became alarmed at the spread of sexually transmitted diseases between his troops. Crucially, however, his primary concern was not the rape or the sexual slavery, but the spread of STDs. Another motivation for the brothels was to curb homosexuality, as Himmler believed that if suspected gay soldiers were forced to have sex with women, it would cure them of their gayness. The Wehrmacht opened brothels in France in the summer of 1940, in Poland shortly after occupation, and similarly in the USSR. All in all, approximately 569 brothels were created and maintained by the Germans throughout the war in the occupied territories, and were used extensively by men of the Wehrmacht. Thousands of soldiers visited these brothels, which in some cases were understaffed, causing women to endure horrific abuse and rape. While soldiers of all armies engaged in rape and sexual assault of women, these instances did not carry the same systematic character that German mass rapes did. Ultimately, the Wehrmacht's creation and supervision of such brothels further disproves the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. Although the Wehrmacht were complicit in and actively participated in Nazi atrocities during World War II, the geopolitical environment of the newly founded Cold War convinced the Western Allies that they needed a newly revived West Germany to act as a bulwark against Soviet invasion in Europe. This motivated the Allies to rehabilitate the image of Nazi war criminals, with the media giving former Nazi generals and politicians positive publicity and advertising their memoirs. Wehrmacht war criminals were allowed to write the history of World War II from their perspective by working in the US Army's historical division, contrary to the idea that history is written by the victor. It wasn't until the 1960s onwards that the clean Wehrmacht narrative was being questioned by historians, who began to fight amongst themselves on how the German army and Germany more broadly should be portrayed during the Nazi years. In Germany at least, the Wehrmacht War Crimes exhibition released in the 1990s and revised in the early 2000s changed how Germans viewed the Wehrmacht and revealed their participation in Nazi atrocities. However, the myth still lives on, especially in online communities, and this is clear if you go into the comments of any piece of online content related to the Wehrmacht or even World War II more broadly. However, as I have shown, the Wehrmacht were not only ideologically entangled with National Socialism, but actively participated in fascist crimes against humanity, thus debunking the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. Thanks for watching.